Hey, I'm Dan Harris. I am a fidgety, skeptical newsman who had a panic attack live on Good Morning America.
To prescribe statins slowly for cancer production.
That led me to something I always thought was ridiculous, meditation. I wrote a book about it, launched an app, and now I'm starting this podcast to try to figure out if there's anything beyond 10%. Basically, here's what I'm obsessed with. Can you be an ambitious person who is nonetheless striving for enlightenment, whatever that means? Let's start the show. Okay, welcome back. Disclaimer right off the top, do not expect journalistic objectivity on this one. My guest today, and this is a horribly overused phrase, but I'm going to use it unapologetically anyway. I think it's fair to say that my guest today changed my life. His name is Dr. Mark Epstein. Just a little quick backstory before I let him talk. In 2009, my wife gave me a book by a guy named Dr. Mark Epstein. I'd never heard of the guy, and he's a psychiatrist based here in New York City, and he writes about the overlap between psychology and Buddhism. I like to tell this story. I actually knew nothing about Buddhism at this point other than the fact that when I was a 15-year-old punk kid, I stole a Buddha statue from a local gardening store and put it in my bedroom because I thought maybe it would help me with the ladies. It didn't. That's another story. And I started to read his book the night my wife gave it to me, and it blew my mind. I had no idea that the Buddha, who I thought of as kind of a religious figure, was actually not a god, not a prophet, mere mortal, albeit probably a genius. And he had sort of a diagnosis of the human condition that I found deeply resonant and I hadn't really heard before. His argument is, he compares the mind to a monkey. He says we're like furry little primates just hurling ourselves through a forest of urges and impulses and desires, constantly latching onto things that won't last in a universe that's characterized by impermanence, and hurling ourselves from one hit of pleasant experience to the next, one movie, one latte, one birthday to the next, and never fully satisfied. Mark and I have the same meditation teacher. He's a guy named Joseph Goldstein. And if you've listened to this podcast before, you may have heard some of his guided meditations that we've posted. As Joseph likes to ask people, how many promotions, how many ice cream cones, how many vacations have you experienced, and are you done yet? Of course not. We're insatiable, and in this way, the pursuit of happiness that's enshrined in our founding documents becomes the source of our unhappiness. So this was, I'm just kind of paraphrasing a lot of what Mark writes about, but I found this to be really compelling. So I did something I'd never really done before, which is I actually called the guy up and said, will you have a drink with me? And I wasn't going to interview him, or at that point I didn't know I was going to write a book. I ended up writing a lot about him in my book, 10% Happier, available at fine bookstores everywhere. But so I just wanted to have a drink with the guy. So there was nothing in it for him. And to my surprise, he said yes. And we went and had a drink at a hotel in downtown Manhattan. And then I kind of basically just forced myself into his life and made him become my friend and give me free meditation advice, free counseling, free psychotherapy, a lot of free stuff. And we've been friends. This was in 2009. So it's like, I'm never good at math, but 7 years we've been friends. And so I could say a lot more about Mark, and I will, but let me just shut up for a second and say thank you for coming on the show.
Nice to be here.
So why did you agree to be friends with me? What were you thinking?
When you first called?
Yeah.
I was not thinking. I was like,
So
this is interesting.
Mistake.
No one ever calls and wants to go out for a drink like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Even after all the books you've written?
Yeah.
By the way, the name of the book that I read, in case you're wondering, he's written 6 books. His 7th is going to come out sometime next year, I believe. The name of the book that I read was Going to Pieces Without Falling Apart. We're going to talk about a lot of his books during the course of this podcast. But that book, I highly I recommend all of his books, but that was the first one I read, and we'll talk about a lot of the other ones. But anyway, you met this kind of strange, over-caffeinated, hyper self-obsessed TV reporter, and he demanded that you see him semi-regularly on an unpaid basis. Why did you continue with that?
Well, I liked you from the beginning, so that's probably the main reason. But also you asked good questions, and I enjoyed that because your questions made me think, and I think in the same way that writing my books has helped me understand Buddhism and psychotherapy to the extent that I do, because it forces me to say what I think, that in answering your questions, it actually helped my thinking. So I enjoyed that. And you always picked up the check, which, so, like, why not come?
Well, there is that. There is that. Even Buddhists can be bought.
Mm-hmm.
So how and when and where? I know the story obviously because I've read probably twice or three times everything you've ever written. But just for the listeners who may not know, how, when, where, why, how did you just start meditating and find Buddhism?
I started meditating probably in my first or second year of college. I took an introduction to world religion class my freshman year in college, and the first semester was Eastern religion, and I read the Dhammapada, which is a collection of Buddhist verse for lay people, and something in it spoke to me, and I keep going back to it. And then my father, who's a physician, he was at Harvard then, where I was.
And he worked with my mother.
He worked with your mother, which I did not know. But he was like, what are you studying? And I said, well, I took this religion class and I'm taking a psychophysiology class and I'm interested in this Eastern stuff maybe. And he said, oh, there's a guy working for me who's doing research on this, whose name was Herbert Benson, who had written a book called The Relaxation Response.
Huge bestseller.
Bestseller in the 70s. He did research on what was then TM.
Transcendental meditation.
Transcendental meditation. And I went to work for him in the summer, and I actually started meditating then using his method that he had stolen from TM.
Wait, basically he gave you a mantra, which was like the word one.
Yeah, he said
like
repeat
that.
the word one instead of a secret mantra.
Silently in your head.
Silently in your head, yeah. So I tried that myself sitting in front of the typewriter or whatever preceded computers then.
An abacus.
Yeah, something like that, yeah. And then it was after that I the graduate student teacher in the psychophysiology class was a guy named Daniel Goleman, who was then in graduate school, went on to become the psychology writer at the Times, and then wrote Emotional Intelligence. But he already had been in India, and there was something about him that I wanted, something I saw that I liked and wanted for myself. And he's the one who told me, oh, go, if you want to know more, go out to Naropa, which was like a Buddhist summer camp in Colorado, where I met Joseph Goldstein and Jack Kornfield and Ram Dass and Sharon Salzberg. And that's really when I started doing Buddhist meditation.
And those people, just for those of you who don't know, all those names you just listed are the sort of, they often get referred to by me included as the
especially
Jew-boos.
by you.
Yeah, especially by me as the Jew-boos, these sort of young Jewish people who had gone over
Young Jewish
India,
people.
who had gone over to India and learned how to meditate and come back and started teaching.
They were just back. So Joseph and Sharon knew each other. Jack, they didn't know. They were all converged in Boulder, and they were each teaching individual classes. And I was still a student in college, so I took their classes and then befriended them, and then sat the first meditation courses that they taught, and then traveled to Asia with them. And I'm still close with all of them.
It's interesting you say that Danny Goleman, who's now a friend of both of ours, you introduced me to him, had something you wanted, because that's the way I felt about you the first time I met you, because I had been kind of on a little mission after having had a panic attack and looking around at different ways to be less of an idiot, and had met a lot of self-help gurus who had really sent my BS meter into overdrive, and you seemed kind of slightly happier than average, but totally not claiming to be perfected or anything like that. You seem kind of comfortable with your imperfections. Maybe I'm just making this up a little bit, but that's the way you seem to me. Is
It's
that
a good way to seem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that was I misreading you?
No, well, let's hope not. But I think that personal attraction thing, that's in the Buddhist world, people tend to downplay desire, or attachment even, or attraction as something that we're trying to get rid of. But I've always found that there's a healthy element to it. I've tried to incorporate that into a lot of my writing. But the thing about Danny Goleman was that he was wearing purple bell-bottom pants. And I was like, corduroy, purple bell-bottom corduroy pants. And I was like, oh, who is this guy? Those are really nice pants. And his wife made them for him in India or something, he told me.
I question your fashion taste, but I will
Yeah,
give
well,
you
it was
a pass.
1972.
No, fair enough. And I have a hard time knowing Danny now, picturing him in purple corduroy.
I'll show you some pictures.
I would love to see those pictures, and then I'm going to blackmail him. But you, so the ease that sort of wafts off you now, and that I got from you in 2009, and I know, again, I'm not trying to say that you never have your bad or uncomfortable or unhappy moments. And the fact that you're open about that actually makes all of it so much more credible and aspirational for me. But that was actually not the case back in 1972 when you were first getting into this. You describe yourself in a lot of your books as being a pretty uncomfortable, unhappy, uptight kind of guy.
Yeah, well, in order to make the books make sense, I have to accentuate those aspects of who I was. But I was definitely anxious. And I was, I think, probably a big worrier. And something of a striver also within my, academic world. So my approach to meditation, for instance, was to go to the classes and try really hard and try to get it with my mind, which was very frustrating. And one of the breakthroughs that I had in those early days was to tap into some other way of relating to meditation and other people and myself that I got off the Buddhist thing once I entered it in a different way.
The breakthrough, if memory serves, actually came through juggling?
The breakthrough that summer came from juggling because I was at this Buddhist summer camp / university where everyone was very serious about their spiritual aspirations. But I had these two roommates who had been assigned to me randomly, who were they were twins, sons of Holocaust survivors. Parents owned a fruit and vegetable store in Long Beach, Long Island, and they were into like Back to Eden and naturopathy and herbs, and they got disgusted right away with all the egos of the supposedly egoless Buddhist teachers, and they stopped going to classes and started driving to Denver in the early morning and bringing back big crates of fruits and vegetables into our little apartment. And they taught me to juggle. One of them was already a good juggler, so I would practice with the oranges on the couch, in between classes. And it was, and I was, diligently practicing. And once I got the 3 oranges in the air, like my mind had to relax in order to keep it going. And I understood, oh yeah, I can use, this is what they're trying to tell me to do in meditation. So that helped.
You say in some ways, and this isn't actually, I was recently rereading your most recent book, which is also excellent. It's called The Trauma of Everyday Life. And you talk about this juggling moment, and you say, I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but it was like as if you were juggling, your mind was juggling the balls, but your mind was also being juggled.
Yeah, I think the thing I learned from meditation that maybe I saw first in the juggling was that I was usually so centered in my thinking mind, it never occurred to me to go elsewhere. But in order to do the juggling, I had to be more, in my body maybe, or in a less cerebral place. And I've come to see that as a therapist, when people are bringing emotional experience to me that they're uncomfortable with, that there's a way that we can be with the emotional experience as well as the stories we're telling ourselves, as well as the physical sensation of just being in a body, that there's a way to be with all of that that's sort of like the juggling, where it's all part of us. It's not like they're different parts. We're only one person. But it's all happening. And in meditation, we can sort of fall back and experience things that way. But it's possible in therapy and in life also.
So 44 years of meditation? Again, I'm not...
probably 42.
42.
Depends when you say I started.
Okay.
Yeah.
What kind of impact has it had on you? And what do you think you'd be like now if you'd never found it?
That's like one of those impossible questions because I've been intrigued by it for so long that it's been, in and out. It's been a big thread in my life. So who would I be without it? I might have found something else. I might have just been doing drugs. I'd probably be just another version of who I already am. Maybe a little more anxious, maybe worrying a little more, or maybe I would have found another way to deal with that aspect of myself. I don't know. But I'm happy to, I'm not tired of it yet. That much I could say. It's given me inspiration in my life that hasn't gone away. That's only kind of opened and become more.
What do you think you get out of it?
I think that idea of refuge, like a place of refuge inside of myself, it's less what I get out of it than that it gives me a place to go. So it's nice to have a place to go.
Where are you going?
Inside somewhere, inside to a kind of timeless place. I was trying to explain this to my father before my father died. He died of a brain tumor, I think like 8 years ago, and he had a brain tumor on the silent part of his brain. So he was totally conscious and aware, unimpacted except for his sense of balance and direction. But I had never talked to him. He was a physician, as I mentioned before, a scientist, and I had never talked to him about the spiritual stuff since the time when he sent me to Dr. Benson. But I realized, he's going to die, and maybe I should try to talk to him about what I've maybe learned from this whole thing. So I said to him on the phone something like, that place inside of you where you feel the same, you were who you were when you were 19 and who you were when you were 30 and who you were when you were 50. It doesn't really feel any different. And that place, if you try to look at it, it's hard to find. It's sort of invisible or transparent, but you kind of know you're you in there. I said that's the place they say that if you relax into that, you can kind of ride that out when you're dying. And I think I was trying to talk about what is the place I go to in meditation when I'm not just thinking. And he was like, okay, darling, I'll try. But he was really listening. That's the closest I've come to being able to describe what that place might be.
And what's your process when you meditate now? Mm-hmm. How do you get to this place that you're describing? What do you do, and how long do you do it, and where do you do it, and when?
I long ago stopped being religious about the meditating, so I'm not trying to do it for X amount of time or trying to do it at certain times of the day or whatever. But if the time opens up, then I'm happy to meditate. And I have a few places around the house that are good for that. So I'll go to one of them. And I don't do it with a clock or a watch or anything. I just sit until I'm ready to get up. And I watch my breath I use the breath as the central object. So when I breathe in, I try to know that I'm breathing in. When I breathe out, I try to know that I'm breathing out. But I've stopped trying to zero in on the sensation of the breath as precisely as I did for a long time, realizing I could back off from that a little bit, and that opens it up a little more, or it has recently. So I do it when I can for as long as feels right, and I've been trying every year to go on a silent retreat for a week or 10 days or however much time I can give myself.
Talk a little bit more about not fixating so much on the sensations of the breath. What are you feeling instead?
That came out of the last retreat that I did, where one of the instructors mentioned that as a possibility, and it spoke to me. So I've been practicing. I instead of trying too hard to find the precise sensation, I've just been like, when you breathe in, know that you're breathing in. That's how the actual instructions read.
Right from the Buddha.
When you breathe out, know that you're breathing out. So okay, I do know when I'm breathing in. I'm often like slightly criticizing myself for not being able to find the breath the way I think I'm supposed to, like that never really, I think I was like that 40 years ago, and that element is still with me. So I'm trying to work with that. So I realized, okay, I know when I'm breathing in, I know that I'm breathing in when I breathe in. So that's good enough. And I know that I'm breathing out when I breathe out. And that, I think, helps me settle into a more concentrated place, which I think is like the stepping stone for, that balance between effort and no effort that is seems productive in meditation.
But how does what you're describing, sort of knowing you're breathing in, knowing you're breathing out, how does that get you to this place you were describing to your father?
How does it get you there?
Yeah, how?
The whole thing, the whole thing is mysterious, and God knows how one thing leads to another. But what I've seen very clearly over the years is that the meditation is a real thing. It's not a fake thing. It's like if you really do it, stuff happens. It teaches you. But it doesn't teach you if you don't do it. But if you just do the basic thing of like, breathe in, know you're breathing in, breathe out, know you're breathing out. If you're thinking, know that you're thinking. If you're feeling stuff, know that you're feeling it. The meditation has a momentum that brings you places, shows you things. So one of the things it's shown me is that what I was trying to describe before, that transparent, subjective place that we could call self or no self, but that we all kind of know that it's there, but don't spend that much time in it.
The inner Mark.
Well, is it really Mark? I
Right.
don't know. I had a whole thing about Mark on one of my retreats too.
Tell me.
Like, I don't really like that name. And, and I felt the sort of like burden of the name, like people calling me Mark when I was a little boy and stuff, and having to answer to it. I was like, oh, it's just a name. Like, what a relief. I don't have to, I don't really have to be Mark. It doesn't have to be an inner Mark either,
One of the most confusing things about Buddhism, at least to me, I think for a lot of people, is this idea of no self, selflessness.
Yeah.
Not in the sense of generosity, but the fact that the inner, well, let's take the inner Dan, since you don't like the inner Mark so much. The inner Dan, which is this feeling we have of being ourselves. If you look for it, you won't really find it. But if we didn't exist, we wouldn't have to put our pants on in the morning, right? So how do we understand this thing of we don't really exist, there's no self?
Yeah, well, you don't really exist, but you do have to put your pants on in the morning. So that is, you could just work with that idea. But selflessness, I think probably selflessness might really mean selflessness like kindness to the other. It could be as simple as that. I think it's also that the self that we take so seriously, it's not as real as we feel it to be when we're in our neurotic, self-obsessed, worry. Robert Thurman, my friend, the professor of Buddhist studies at Columbia, he had a Mongolian Tibetan teacher when he was young in the early 60s, who used to say to him, it's not that you're not real. Of course you're real. Your problem is you think you're really real. So it's that sense, I always like that. It's that sense of really real that I think the Buddhist no self is after. When you peel away the endless kinds of stories that we're repeating subconsciously about who we think we are. When you see those things as just stories, just thoughts, no more real than any other kind of thought, it's not that thoughts don't have their own reality, but they have a very evanescent reality. So all the thoughts about yourself are just that also. Take all that away, and then you don't really know who you are. And it's in the not really knowing who you are that maybe you're getting close to what the Buddhists are describing in no self or emptiness or whatever.
But so what?
So that's liberating, because then the inner Dan doesn't have to be the inner Dan that the inner Dan thinks he is,
Yeah, but
then you could be such a much nicer person. It's turning out to be true.
Yeah, don't Don't.
You always quote your wife as saying it's true.
No, she doesn't. She says I'm less of a jerk.
But she knows how to talk to you.
Well, that's probably. We just had a long and interesting conversation that I will actually discuss with you.
Okay,
at
you'll have to tell me.
Yeah, because I'm going to use this as yet another occasion for free therapy, and there's no food that I'm buying you, so this is really going to cost you.
That's true.
Anyway, but getting back to this whole no self thing,
Yeah.
I've never really known what to do with it. It is true and very interesting that if you close your eyes and look for you, or look for like one of the exercises that Joseph teaches, which I think he's taken from Dzogchen teachers, which is a kind of a flavor of Tibetan Buddhism, but which is to listen to sounds.
Yeah.
You talk about this too. Listen to sounds and look for what is hearing.
Yeah.
And you won't find
What is
the hearer,
knowing? I think
or
he says what is knowing, because you're hearing the sound, but what is, he says what, but it could be who is knowing.
What?
The knowing is just there. It's just there. There doesn't have to be this intermediary of like the solid self. But everyone who hears this, who wants to understand it, too much, starts to feel that they have to throw out the obvious, as if they don't exist, period. And even in Buddhist thought, they've had to deal with this. Once they put forth the idea of no self, but then they also had the idea of reincarnation, then they had to explain, if there's no self, but you get reincarnated, who's getting reincarnated, So there's definitely, so then it's, you can think about the soul, but they also had a thing about no soul. But there is and obviously there's a stream of consciousness that makes up the individual person. Who you were at 5 and who you are at 40, you're not the same, that's obvious, but you are connected. So there is an inner something that is proceeding through time. Now, that inner something, we don't, if you stop and look for it, it's by no means clear what that inner something is. So being willing to keep looking and wondering and holding the not knowing, that's, I think, as close as you can come to understanding the no self thing without distorting it.
But again, and I know you just
What
said
do you get out of
yeah,
that?
what do you get out of it?
A sense of freedom. A sense of freedom. And maybe it plays into the selflessness as kindness to others, because you can see, you start to be able to see other people locked into their various conceptions of who they are, what they're capable of, what's holding them back, what they're angry about, what they're ashamed of. And you can see everyone, way burdened in a way that maybe they don't need to be.
You had, if memory serves, a bit of a breakthrough on this idea of self, which you describe in your last book, which again I'm going to name the Trauma of Everyday Life, which sounds like a pessimistic title, but is actually not, which we can talk about.
Yeah, it's sort of a scary title for people. It was meant to have a little humor, but
it's a phenomenal book. You talk about taking a walk while on a retreat a few years ago, outside of the Insight Meditation Society, where we both practice in Barre, Massachusetts, Barre, Massachusetts, a great place to take a retreat if you're going to take one, where you have a little bit of a sort of a moment. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah,
Can you
yeah,
describe
yeah.
it?
I think I had been reading. You're not supposed to read on these retreats, but they have a little library at the retreat center there, and I would usually go for maybe half an hour at sunset and just pick things at random and see if they spoke to me in the midst of the retreat environment. So I think I had been reading something, the punchline of which was there's no self apart from the world. And because, like you were just asking, this thing of self, no self, like what am I looking for when I'm meditating? What's it, that's always in the mind when doing this practice. So I like that phrase, there's no self apart from the world. And then when I was taking this walk, which I like to do when I'm on retreat there, I would go out early in the morning, like after breakfast, but 7 o'clock kind of thing. So the birds are all alive, even in the middle of winter, and the sun is trying to peek through, and so on. And there's a nice walk on an old stage coach road kind of thing. And I was walking and listening to the birds and looking at everything, and in that meditative place. I'd probably been there for a few days, and that phrase, "There's no self apart from the world," started to resonate. Like I was just in my sensory experience, and realizing that me and the world weren't two separate things. It's kind of, it gets trite if you try to talk about it, but my usual experience is I'm here and the world's out there, and I'm walking through it kind of thing. But I was like, okay, no self apart from the world. My eyes are just reflecting what's out there. My ears are just responding to what's out there. And that sense of there being one indivisible union, that included me in the world. All of a sudden I thought, oh, maybe I'm really understanding something. And I remember I went to Joseph Goldstein, who was in residence as the teacher there, and I described this, and he was like, "Oh yeah, that might work for a while," something like that.
But that seems like the freedom, like just the intellectual or even the visceral knowing that, okay, this self, the inner Dan is real but not really real. The really getting a gut level sense of the indivisibility, that you aren't separate from the world. How can you be? You're great. You're created out of the same atoms.
Well, I think that's the
stars.
inspiration in a way, or that gives you some kind of confidence that you don't have to be, like you always like to say, you don't have to be the I think the freedom is more like when your boss is giving you a hard time, or your daughter is making you feel bad, or you're having a fight with someone close to you, that you don't have to respond in the way you normally do. That you have that you actually feel like you don't have to, and somehow that experience of that you're asking me to talk about, of taking that walk, somehow that is helpful. That memory is helpful in those other more stressful moments. I don't quite know if I could explain why, but I'm pretty sure it is.
The thing that sort of comes through, and just in this conversation, I'm sure people hear it, and it's come through in all of our conversations, is maybe this is what led to me calling the book 10% Happier in a way, which is that you really do not oversell or even try to sell at all the notion of meditation. When I asked you, what's it done for you, you were like, well, maybe it's maybe I'm a little bit less anxious after 40 whatever years of doing this. Where does that kind of modesty vis-a-vis the impact of meditation come from?
I'm still waiting for the 10%.
You haven't even gotten that.
I don't know. Where does the modesty come from?
Yeah, why do you play it down? Or maybe you're not playing it down.
I don't think I'm playing it down. I think I'm not playing it up,
Yeah.
because I'm not selling it. And I don't think it's right for everybody, the meditation. I'm a therapist. I've been a psychiatrist, like seeing people in therapy for almost as long, 30 some years. And people want a quick fix, they want something that's going to change them. And maybe that's our culture, or maybe that's just people, but psychotherapy's not a quick fix. Meditation's not a quick fix. People are, even if there's no self, people are really hard to change. Meditation requires that you actually do it, which most people don't. And it might not even be the right thing for a lot of people to be, sit there struggling with their minds, So I'm definitely not trying to sell it. I feel like it's been a big help for me in my life. So, and I've written a lot of books about it. I'm not hiding that. But I think it's there for people who are drawn to it for whatever reason, to explore themselves. And when that happens, like for you, who would have thought you would have gotten so into it? And you really have, and you're doing all the, look what's come out of you as a result. So, and that does happen, occasionally. But
What
it really touches somebody.
What do you do? In your view, what's more effective? And maybe this is a false binary, but what do you
Yeah.
think is more effective, therapy or meditation?
Oh, it totally depends. I think one of the things I object to, the way mindfulness has taken over popular consciousness in the therapy world, is that it's kind of edged out traditional psychotherapy, so that a lot of people in training feel like they just want to learn how to be a mindfulness teacher instead of learning how to be a psychodynamic psychotherapist. Or a lot of people feel that if they just learn mindfulness, they can get help with their uh, childhood feelings that are still haunting them, that it should be enough. And I don't think it is for a lot of people. So I'm all about, use whatever helps, including medicine and so on. I just gave the other day someone who had a lot of trouble going to public events, public speaking, or even going to a dinner party because he would feel really anxious. I gave a little bit of the stage fright drug,
No, beta blocker.
beta blocker, propranolol or Inderol, and they were like, "Oh my God, why didn't anybody give me this?" Like 20 years ago. Like, walked into the party, had a good time, didn't berate themselves. That's much more effective than either psychotherapy or meditation, but because it's very specific for that person, for that particular thing. So sometimes there are very specific treatments that help, sometimes not. And then, so everyone has to find what works for them.
I strongly agree with that, and I may feel this way just because I've known you for a while, but there are a lot of arrows in the quiver when it comes to well-being.
Yeah.
Therapy, medicine, medication, sleep, diet, exercise, good relationships, having a meaningful work life. And you don't have to choose one, and none of them is a silver bullet.
Right.
I think meditation has been really useful for me, but I agree. I'm glad I called the book 10% Happier, even though I'm stuck with math jokes the rest of my life. But because I think the overselling is a problem in the culture for sure. What do you think about I wasn't going to go there, but you brought up the sort of mindfulness excitement that's in the culture right now. Do you feel like it's edging out? You talked about it edging out traditional psychotherapy. Do you feel like it's edging out Buddhism in a way, and is that worrisome to you?
No, it might be edging out itself. The pendulum might have swung already. People may start questioning, it's sort of like Prozac, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. Everyone wanted to take Prozac because it helped some people so much. So everyone who needed help with anything wanted Prozac, and if Prozac doesn't help you, then it's like just drinking water, you just get the side effects or nothing happens. So I'm all for the mindfulness movement. I think it's been wonderful, that people have picked up on one aspect of Buddhism that is, a wonderful thing. And I think it helped the psychotherapy field to realize that there's a practical technique that can be taught, that people can take home, that you could learn in a group, that people could practice together, all of that. But, you can't, people really want that quick fix thing. And so inevitably they're going to be disappointed. So then it'll find its place.
Yeah, I think it should just be, to use the analogy again, I think it just should be another arrow in the quiver. I mean, one of the kind of things that we think about when we think about, when we're trying to figure out how to improve our own well-being, this should just be something we can turn to. But it isn't going to be, it's not going to be the be-all and end-all, and it's not going to be to the exclusion of
other things.
Yeah.
And the thing about psychotherapy is that the time and the culture that Buddhism came from, there is no psychotherapy, and there was hardly a psychological self. Perhaps we don't know what the self was like 2,500 years ago, but certainly in Asian cultures now, there's a huge need for psychotherapy that is only beginning to be talked about. They're not cultures where people feel free to even investigate their more difficult emotions. You just have to put them away to, do what you have to do in your family and for your job and so on.
But that doesn't sound super healthy to me.
No, I don't think it is super healthy.
Yeah. So just on the issue of the sort of efficacy of meditation, I mean, I had experience last week that would be worth discussing with you. Bianca, my wife, who you know, she had a double mastectomy last week, so it's pretty intense. And it was interesting to watch my own reactions around it because I'm so squeamish and not naturally super, like, nurturing. There was a passage in one of your books, Going on Being, where you talked about during the birth of, I think, your second child, you were a little detached in the delivery room, and your wife was a little annoyed at you because you thought you were kind of applying some of the lessons of meditation, but you were misapplying them. But I kind of tried to lean in, even though I'm so squeamish that I could feel it in my body, and I was getting cold, and I was also getting angry that she was in pain, and but I tried to be right there for her and look at the wounds in a way that I wouldn't normally do, even though my parents are doctors and Bianca's a doctor. But I really try to not fight my own instincts, but be aware of my instincts and let them pass and do what I thought was the right thing, which was to lean in.
Yeah.
So I'll just stop talking and see what you have to say about any of that, including your own experience that I mentioned.
Well, I think just the way that you were describing it is sort of the answer to the question that you were asking me before, like how does all this help? That you were able to not repress or suppress your own instincts, but kind of allow them to float around wherever they floated around in your head, and then deliberately try to do what you thought to be the right thing. That just seems like a very fruitful use of the meditation. So I hope she felt what you were doing, not what you were thinking.
Well, I told her both. I mean, I think she felt it, and we were just
I'm
talking about it.
Partly kidding.
Well, no, kidding is fine. We just had a funny conversation in which she was asking me, we were talking about why she was saying that she thought I was very supportive and she wanted to say thank you. And I was saying it's ridiculous to be thank you. This should be basic cable. If you have major surgery, your spouse should be like right there. And that's like, it's not non-negotiable.
Yeah.
So I don't know if her thanking me was, speaks to the low bar that she set or what. But she was kind of asking me, I know how squeamish you are. So what was going on that you were able to kind of lean in, and I don't know. I was listing a bunch of the things, and one of the things I said was spousal loyalty, and she was like, "Oh, so do you mean love?" And I said, "Yes, that's actually what I meant." But I think this is exactly what meditation, where the benefit of where the rubber hits the road with meditation.
Yeah.
So I've been doing it for 7 years, not a long time, but if you work on your biceps for 7 years, like you'll be able to lift stuff up. And if you work on seeing clearly how your mind and body are at any given moment without getting carried away by it, then I think when you need it, sometimes you'll be more effective or less.
Well, it's such a good example of how you end up feeling better by doing the thing that's a little more difficult, because you didn't have to pull so far away from her.
Or it just because yes, and also there's just less of a you see that the buffers between you and doing the thing that is really the right thing to do aren't as solid as you thought.
It's just your mind. I know, it's just your mind. Yeah.
So I don't know if I'm now overselling meditation, but I do think that it can be useful, and that was a great example for me personally. I talk a lot about, just sort of getting back to your last book, I talk a lot about mindfulness. We talked about the other thing that people talk about in Buddhism, which is selflessness, but mindfulness is the other big thing. And I talk about it in a pretty workaday manner. I think about it as the ability to see what's going on in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it, which is really what was going on with me in the hospital with Bianca. But you actually put it in a really, in really, I think, beautiful and elevated terms. And I'm just going to pick a quote from your last book. and just get you to talk about it a little. One of the central paradoxes of Buddhism is that the bare attention of the meditative mind changes the psyche by not trying to change anything at all. The steady application of the meditative posture, like the steadiness of an attuned parent, allows something inherent in the mind's potential to emerge, and it emerges naturally if left alone properly in a good enough way.
Sounds like the way I write. A little too, a little too complicated.
No.
I think so. I'm trying to get simpler. I like the phrase "bare attention." I like to mix that up with mindfulness. One of the first books that I ever read about mindfulness, about Buddhism, was called "The Heart of Buddhist Meditation" by who I thought was a Sri Lankan monk from Ceylon named Nyanaponika Thera. Thera's Thera, which just means elder, it turns out. And Nyanaponika means flowing towards wisdom, I think. But he was a German refugee. Nyanaponika was a German refugee named, I think, Sigmund Fenninger or something, who left Berlin in the 30s and went to Sri Lanka and studied Buddhism, and then got put in a prisoner of war camp by the British during the war, did a lot of translations of Buddhist texts, and then moved back to Sri Lanka and started the Buddhist Publication Society. And he wrote a lot of the first like Westerners interpreting Buddhism for us. He must have written in German and then it got translated into English. I'm not sure. But anyway, he used this phrase, bare attention, which he had a good definition for that I almost know. The clear and single-minded awareness of what happens to us and in us at the successive moments of perception. Just the bare knowledge, like an exact registering, knowing your reactions as separate from the thing itself.
It's like the raw data of experience.
Like the raw data of experience, yeah. So I really like that. I keep coming back to that. I think the first Dharma talk, the first kind of attempt I ever made to teach Buddhism in a public way, I framed it around that idea of bare attention. And then years after I read that book and actually met Nyanaponika when I went to Sri Lanka the first time, I became very influenced by this British child psychoanalyst, Donald Winnicott, D.W. Winnicott, who talks about what the ordinary devoted mother, he wrote in the 40s and 50s, so you could say mother or parent, but the attitude of the ordinary devoted good enough mother who doesn't intrude but doesn't abandon in the face of her child's anger, rage, ruthless attacks, etc. And I always thought that what he was describing in the quote-unquote good enough parent was similar, if not identical, to what Nyanaponika was describing when he's talking about bare attention or mindfulness. That what we're doing when we're trying to be mindful is we're basically applying that kind of maternal attention that's part of our biological inheritance. You know, we have it in us already. And like you were saying before, if you practice it over time, it gets stronger. What was great about Winnicott was he was saying, look, this is intuitive. It's there naturally in a mother. You don't need, he was like working in the 50s, like, breastfeed. It's okay to breastfeed. Trust yourself. Don't listen to the experts. He was all about like bringing out what's already there in the mother. And I think there's something in Buddhism that's like bringing out what's already there in the mind. We know how to do this, even if we don't know how to do it. You know, once we sort of find the thread of it, like with the juggling, you know, then it can take over.
So like when you're on the cushion, when you're meditating, whatever, you can view the contents of your own consciousness with I guess, isn't there a Tibetan, or maybe it's Tibetan, I don't know what you can kind of view it like a grandparent watching kids playing in a playground,
Yeah.
you know, with some remove, but a beneficent remove.
Thich Nhat Hanh says, hold anger like a baby, which I always like.
Does it work for you?
A little bit. Sometimes, if
Episodically.
I'm not too angry. If I'm just sitting on the cushion, it's easy. Yeah.
Do you still, after all this time, get pretty deeply pissed off sometimes?
Oh yeah, of course. What do you think? It does. It's not like it goes. I don't think. I don't believe in that thing that it goes away.
Do you believe that you can handle it better?
Do I believe that I can handle it better? Better than I could have once? Yeah, sure.
So we're talking about parenting and D.W. Winnicott. What,
Yeah.
what kind of, you have two grown children. I have a 17-month-old holy terror named Alexander. What kind of impact can meditation and mindfulness have on parenting?
Um,
And what advice would you impart to me?
what advice would I impart to you?
Mm-hmm.
After the baby goes to sleep, that's the good time to meditate.
In the room?
No, just in the house, because there's when you have little kids, it's like all about the little kids all the time. There's no real escape. Even if you have a good babysitter or whatever, you're still totally conscious of what's going on. But there's that nice moment. It's like when dusk falls, when the child takes his or her nap, or when they go to sleep at 7 or 8 or 9 or whenever you manage to get them asleep. Then it's like peace falls in the household. So your impulse is to go have a drink or have dinner or read the paper or turn the TV on or whatever. But there's a nice moment there to meditate. And I used to meditate when my kids had trouble falling asleep or wanted me to stay in the room with them longer than I really wanted to stay in the room with them. But I thought that, how that is when you're a parent. You don't know, should you be strict or should you give them what they're claiming to need. So I set for a few years, I set my meditation cushion up in the room with them. And then if they were having trouble going to sleep or whatever, I would just sit and meditate. And then eventually they would fall asleep, but they knew I was there, kind of thing. And then I remember at various times they would call to me, like, Daddy, will you come meditate with me? And so I felt like that was going to be helpful for them. But I think now that they're older, they're both in their 20s, some of my faith that if I just, meditated around them or introduced them, made this part of what they were growing up in, that it would take care of all of their problems, I've been disabused of that. They're their own individuals. They have their own stuff to work out. My wife and I tried really hard to, like many of our generation, to be there for everything we could do, and they still have to find their own way. So that's sobering.
Do they meditate? Did you encourage them to do so?
I didn't encourage them, but I let them know that it was out there for them. They knew all the all the characters who had influenced me and become my friends, and they each, especially in their time in college, where now you can I guess when I was in college you could take courses in it too, but they each kind of investigated it while they were in college and tried to see whether there was anything for them in it. I think they're still figuring that out.
Yeah, I've talked to your older daughter, Sonia. I've talked to her about it a little bit.
Yeah.
She said she's gone on retreats.
She
and
went
stuff
on a
like-
couple of retreats. Yeah, they have these retreats in Barrie for young people, which they define as, I think, up to 30 now. I used to always be the youngest one on the retreats, when I was in my 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in my 50s, I still felt like I was the youngest one on the retreat. So,
When do you have a goal for your meditation? Are you trying to get enlightened?
I'm definitely trying to get enlightened. Yeah.
And what do you mean by that? What do you?
I don't know what I mean by it anymore. I'm like pursuing the goal that I don't understand.
And how do you pursue it? Do you pursue it are you really gunning for it, or are you kind of pursuing it in a softer way?
I'm really gunning for it in a softer way, because I've figured out that the softer way is actually the more intense way.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you gun for it in too aggressive a way, it's obviously not going to work. So you have to back off. So then the backing off is really, you're still trying. I'm still trying as hard as ever by backing off.
Fair enough. I kind of understand
If
that.
that makes sense.
A little bit.
Mhm.
The traditional definition, at least from my reading of Buddhism, of enlightenment is, or full enlightenment, is the uprooting of greed, hatred, and delusion.
Well, that's the easy definition.
Okay,
That's the definition they give you if you start asking too many questions, and they don't want to tell you if they believe it's an actual experience.
Well, give
or
us the
not.
real thing.
I don't know what the real thing is.
What are you gunning for in your
I
software?
told you I lost touch with the goal, with what it actually is. But I just read this. I was reading this little book about one of Sharon and Joseph's teachers. You know this woman Deepa Ma? Have you heard stories about Deepa Ma? I have this little book about her. I think it's called Knee Deep in Grace or something. I never really looked at it because it's a collection of testimonials and it looked kind of, what's that word, like hagiographic or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, I met her a couple of times and she was wonderful, but I never had a deep connection with her. But I was reading for something I'm writing now. I wanted to look at it. And deep in that book, you might not have seen this yet. I know you're interested in this question of enlightenment. Someone talks about her talking about her enlightenment, her first enlightenment experience. And she says something like, she was sitting and then there was just this it's almost like nothing happened. It was like the rustling of a bird's wing or something. And just an instant that had a different quality, like a sort of almost like really nothing quality, and that was her first enlightenment experience.
That would have been stream entry.
Whatever they call it, yeah. I mean, I think early Buddhism created a bunch of narratives around these experiences that then they coded into, made a story out of. So yes, stream entry, but that was her first. According to either her or whoever's telling the story, that the nature of the experience was that ephemeral.
Why?
But not something she missed.
But why are you gunning for this thing that you've lost? Why set this goal that you can't even define?
I didn't set the goal. The goal comes with the territory.
Yeah, but you can ignore it.
I basically have ignored it. Except that I believe in it.
You're talking like one of these, like
you're
talking like
me,
Yoda, like who's giving this elliptical.
You're asking me to tell you what's real. I'm trying to tell you this is how I think about it.
But you see how it would be confusing, right? Or are you deliberately trying to confuse?
I'm deliberately confused.
You are deliberately confused.
Or I'm indeliberately confused.
Do you think it's do you think for you having this goal, however you hold it, is serves you?
Yeah, I think so. Like there's a famous story about Tsongkhapa. He's the great saint of the Gelugpa school of Tibetan Buddhism. Lived in the 14th century. When he got enlightened, the first thing he did when he got enlightened, he wrote a big enlightenment statement, But the first thing he said was, it's exactly the opposite of what I thought it was going to be, which I always like that because I know I'm not enlightened. So what do I think it's going to be? How do I imagine it? Like a great cessation, no more greed, hatred, and delusion, like going to a heavenly place, like finally understanding everything, what are the what's the opposite of all of that? What would that be? So I don't know, but for sure it's not going to be what I'm imagining it's going to be, right?
But the Buddha was pretty explicit about what it is. The uprooting
was he?
of greed.
Yeah.
Well, I thought. I mean, like I've read a little bit of the scriptures,
Yeah.
and he says the uprooting of greed, hatred, and delusion. I mean, I'm not saying I believe in this.
Yeah,
I'm just saying
yeah.
that's what he says it is.
Okay, that would be super nice.
But you don't.
I'll
hold
believe
to that?
it when I see it.
But you don't even hold to that as a Don't you think if you're going to have a goal, it makes sense to have an understanding of what the goal is?
That would make sense. Yes, I'm all for that.
You're not all for that.
And for most goals, yeah.
But why not on this one?
Well, like God. What's God?
I have no
does
idea.
anyone understand what God is?
Well, some people claim they do.
Yeah, well, do you believe them?
I am respectfully agnostic.
Okay,
How about that?
so the uprooting of greed, hatred, and delusion. That would be nice.
So I should hold the same respectful agnosticism toward that, maybe as well.
Maybe. I mean, whatever you want.
But it's just for me. Okay, set you aside for a second. For me, it is hard. It's a very. I'm interested in whatever lies beyond 10% happier.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to define it. I don't even know if I believe in it.
Well, you know that the self is a problem,
Yeah.
right? Like we're all sort of like locked in a little bit
Mm-hmm.
to this body-mind phenomenon that we experience as, like Mark or Dan,
Mm-hmm.
and we know it's sort of troubling. Like we're in this body. How did we get in this body? And we have this life, and we're gonna die. We see our parents, and things go wrong, and we're like we know what it's like to be us. And then there's this notion of enlightenment, like what enlightenment says, the idea of enlightenment says the way we're experiencing the world is ignorant or deluded, right? So what does that mean? You sort of know you're deluded, but so there's greed, hatred, and delusion. Like greed, we know. Hatred, we know. Delusion, like what is that? You kind of know what it is. So
I kind of think about it as being confused about it's all. I don't know if I'm going to be able to articulate this well, but the delusion is something around the sense that you are separate from everything else when of course you can't be.
right, maybe that's it. Maybe it's just like no self apart from the world,
Right.
and we're part of the world. But like you were asking me, like what's the so what?
But does it come down to that trite idea of oneness with everything?
Probably not, because we can imagine that. But if it's exactly the opposite of what we can imagine, it's probably much more. It's probably much more about like we're loving entities and we're not always connected to the love that we're capable of. In my mind,
Say more about that.
I don't know.
That's all you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, we're capable of more love than we express.
But that goes back to a connectivity and oneness, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah, perhaps.
Did you read the book On Having No Head?
I did. Joseph loves that book.
Yeah, he recommended it to
Yeah.
me too. So it's a book for listeners and viewers. It's called On Having No Head, and I can't remember the
Some
name of the
German
guy.
guy. Yeah,
British.
a British.
British guy. And I too read this on a retreat, which
Uh-huh.
I know it was like an illicit little book that I kept in my room. But
Yeah.
it really struck me. His idea is his little conceit is that you can see other people's heads, but you can't see your own
Right.
head. And in fact, your experience of the world is of headlessness. And I found that to be actually kind of powerful. I mean, it's silly at first, but it actually is real. That if you look, the way we're experiencing the world is through this kind of yawning chasm of pure knowing, right? But there seems to be something there to that. I don't know if it connects to what
Yeah.
we're talking about with
Yawning
enlightenment.
chasm of pure knowing.
I'm just pulling that out of my butt.
Yeah, that was good.
All right, thanks. But do you think do you see a connection between that and
Yeah, well, like Joseph said when I came to him after that walk, like that'll work for a while. Working with that. Then it kind of loses its
kick?
dynamism. Yeah,
Right,
loses
so-
its kick.
But what is that? So these things work for these little on having no head might work for me for a little while, or some little meditative technique might work for me a little while. But that does seem to indicate that there's something that will do it for you, and we just haven't found it yet.
Yeah.
This is what kind of messes with my mind about about enlightenment.
Well. Also, if I'm right at all about the that we're capable of more love than we're expressing, and that's sort of the point. Then just to say that it's about connection or pure or oneness or whatever, that diminishes the individual responsibility of being, embodied
Right.
or minded, whatever.
and having agency.
Having agency.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure the point is not to just surrender your agency.
Right. So in some ways, it may come back to just sort of normally selfish, self-centered Dan in the hospital last week with his
Yeah.
deeply suffering wife, and I had more to give than I thought
Yeah.
I had to give, even
Yeah.
though, frankly, what I was giving is so, as I said before, basic cable. I mean, like that.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be. I'm not overly proud of myself for not being an absentee husband in that moment, but I did have more to give than I thought I did, and maybe that is kind of like a continuum of enlightenment.
Maybe. You know that the book of mine that you liked, the Going to Pieces Without Falling
Yeah,
Apart.
I like all your books, just for the
But
record.
the one that that brought you to me, the way I structured that book, because I had just read all this Buddhist Tantric stuff, was around the 4 stages of Tibetan Tantra, which are compared to the process of falling in love. So it was, I think, looking, smiling, embracing, and orgasm. Because the closest thing the closest experience that we can have, so it's said, in a regular life that approximates the experience of enlightenment is the process of sexual union. So, and the thing about sexual union is that you're simultaneously yourself, but also in union with the other. So I think there's something about the simultaneity of being an individual, but also connected. That because we think in a binary way, we think we're one or the other, but that they're actually it's all existing simultaneously at its core. Something about that is interesting to me.
Yeah, you in some of your books you talk about sort of porousness of borders,
Yeah,
personal borders.
yeah, yeah. And they use orgasm, in the secret teachings, they use orgasm as, what they're saying is that the underlying nature of reality is orgasmic. That we think about it as, just an instant, but that actually that's the subterranean nature of things. So the
I like
enlightenment, I know. So what if that's enlightenment,
Then that's a goal I would definitely shoot
Right. Yeah. So to speak.
Sorry, that took me a second to get. Normally we cut these things off earlier, but you're so fascinating. A and B, just as an aside, this is not the last time you're going to be on here because you have another book coming out in the not too distant future, and I want to bring you back to talk about that. But before I let you go, if you have time, I want to ask you one last question. Are you cool with that? Mm-hmm. You had recommended to me over brunch not long ago. We get together, and often it's over brunch, and that I investigate more Tibetan Buddhism because most of what I've looked at is known as Theravadan Buddhism, which is kind of the old school early Buddhists. Why did you make that recommendation? Do you remember making that recommendation,
Yeah, sure.
And why?
Well, because over 1,500 years or whatever in the Buddhist culture of South Asia, Buddhism itself evolved, and it went from the predominant view being we're here in samsara, we're here in this life, which is painful and suffering, and we want to escape from it by meditating and reaching enlightenment, and that's going to remove us from this world. That's and we'll achieve nirvana, and there's they parsed it in various ways, but the sort of underlying dominant philosophical position was that nirvana was over there, like suffering and samsara is here and nirvana is over there, and we're trying to escape. That's very simplified. But as Buddhism evolved, and I think as people wrestled with these questions of what is enlightenment and what is the point, and do we just go and meditate ourselves away, or are we supposed to come back and be in the world, that dualistic thing, subtly dualistic thing, people really began to question that. And the later developments in Buddhism that became the Mahayana, and that some of which is preserved in the Buddhism that went to Tibet, questions all of that and is much more about nirvana and samsara being 2 faces of the same coin, 2 sides of the same coin.
Like a Janus.
Yeah. And this idea that I was talking about before of the underlying nature of reality that we think is suffering, it's the deluded or ignorant mind that sees it as suffering. But if we could see everything the way the Buddha saw it, we would be immersed in the orgasmic reality of that is this world, not another place, not another world, And so that, I think once you've been meditating for a while and asking these kinds of questions and wondering about it, it's illuminating to see that, oh yeah, 1,000 years ago, people were questioning this and writing poetry about this and coming up with other possibilities for how to understand it. And, it's refreshing.
Thank you very much for being such a great friend for the last 7 years. Really appreciate it, and for coming on the podcast. You're definitely gonna, if I can convince you, and if I can get you uptown, because you
All the
like
way
to-
downtown. You could get me
like-
uptown easily.
Okay,
No
all right,
problem.
Okay, so I just want to before we go, just want to list some books so that people, because you do a terrible job of pitching your own books.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So I'm going to do it for you. So the book that I read first was called Going to Pieces Without Falling Apart, which is an amazing book. The book that preceded it was called Thoughts Without a Thinker, which is really, you had one book before that, but
No, that was the first one.
okay. So I
Yeah.
think you had maybe a collection of essays before that.
That came later.
Okay, so
Yeah.
Thoughts Without a
Essays I
Thinker.
wrote earlier, but the collection came later.
Okay, there you go. So that book was what?
Psychotherapy Without the Self is
Okay.
a collection of essays
And then
that are more academic than the rest of the books.
So I recommend Going to Pieces Without Falling Apart and Thoughts Without a Thinker to start, but I also think there are several other books that I really like. Going on Being, which is a little bit more autobiographical, and it talks about a lot of the names that you've mentioned in the course of this podcast, Jack and Joseph and Sharon, and how you got into Buddhism and what it's done for you, and also talks about family life as well. Open to Desire, which is an interesting look at desire, which is often denigrated within the Buddhist tradition, but you talk about it in a way that I think will make people feel better about wanting cupcakes. And also The Trauma of Everyday Life, which again sounds kind of pessimistic, but actually has a very realistic, in the most positive sense of the term, sensibility to it. Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah. That book, that book I think got better as it went along. So I think if people get through the beginning's fine, but if people stay with that book, I feel good about that still.
I think it's a phenomenal book. Did I miss?
No,
start
you
to
didn't miss
finish?
any of them.
Okay, and you've got another book. Can I name the book?
Yeah, sure.
Advice Not Given, which is going to be. We've been talking about it for a couple of years, and it's about things you didn't say in during your psychotherapy, psychoanalyst,
Psychotherapy.
psychotherapy sessions. So thank you again. Really appreciate it. And I want to thank the producers of this podcast, Josh Cohan, Lauren Efron, Dan Silver, Sarah Amos, Steve Jones, Andrew Kalb, and to thank you for listening and or watching, because we do this both on podcast and the Apple Podcast Store, also on abcnews.com. You can watch the video. And just a request, if you have questions you want me to ask or people you want me to interview, hit me on Twitter. Some people have already suggested some guests that we're actually reaching out to, and we really appreciate it. I'm at Dan B. Harris. And also, on a more craven note, if you like what we're doing and you want to rate it or review it or recommend it to your friends, we'll always take that. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.